I think this kind of ecological or networked view of nature, I wanted to ask you about kind of these states of ego dissolution, and you mentioned the Hopkins work that kind of started your interest in this, looking at getting kind of overcoming fear of death in cancer patients. To me, I kind of, sometimes people talk about this as if it has a kind of supernatural flavor, that people have identified some kind of soul in themselves that will survive death. But I kind of argue for like a naturalistic view of these insights, where they are valid, but it's kind of like you're seeing yourself as part of this ecological web of nature that will survive the death of the individual. Do you have a particular kind of, having gone through these states as well, where do you sit on this kind of spectrum from naturalistic explanations through to more supernatural?
I tend to be on the naturalistic side of things, and I agree that there's a kind of reconceptualization of who you are, what the self is. And that I remember this woman who had cancer, and she was she a cancer patient? Yes, she was a cancer patient, and she'd had a very powerful psilocybin experience where at one point she went into the soil, herself, however she imagined it. She was going all over the world, but she ended up in the soil, bump up against the wall of a crematorium, and her body got taken up by the plants. Her cells or her elements. And of course, that is what happens. That is a naturalistic thing. That is what happens to the self after death. What was different is she could identify with every cell and every, carbon atom in her body. And so there was a continuity that most of us know exists. Are, the elements of which we're made don't go away when we die. They get repurposed. But most of us don't identify with that. We don't, we're so disconnected from our body, and that seems so abstract. But for some people on psychedelic journeys, that becomes quite real and quite vivid. The other thing that's happening, though, is people are having a rehearsal of death. They're feeling, ego dissolution is a kind of death rehearsal. And it doesn't feel so bad. In fact, it can feel ecstatic. And now it's a death rehearsal with a twist. It's a rehearsal, and people come back from it. And that may not be true of real death. But I think there's some comfort in that too. Just, in the same way our consciousness is constantly running scenarios, right? Practicing various things, courses of action. This is a really good scenario for dying. And I think having gone through it, it loses a little bit of its terror, or a lot of its terror for some people.
Right. And then am I right, it was your first psilocybin experience where you kind of had this flavor of connecting with nature when you're out in your garden?
Yeah. Yeah, this was a trip I had in my garden many years ago that was unguided. And, I've always felt connected to plants. I've written about them. I have a lot of respect for their subjectivity. I see them as having a subjectivity, not in the sense of having a consciousness the way we do, but having a point of view, having goals, survival, reproduction, and that we tend to see them as more inert than we should, or more passive. But this was kind of an intellectual conceit, and it certainly informs the Botany of Desire, that, the subtitle of which is a plant's eye view of the world. Now, plants don't have eyes, they don't have views, but they do have a perspective. They do have an angle on things, and a set of, basic goals. But during the course of this trip, which was quite powerful, I was in my garden. I was walking down this garden path with borders on both sides, and the plants in my garden were clearly returning my gaze. They were very aware of me. I was very intensely aware of them, and we were forming this interesting little community. And I had never been so kind of viscerally aware of their subjectivity. as I was, and I felt very connected to them. They were totally benign and friendly, and so that was yeah. So that was a powerful experience. You know, I don't know what kind of veracity it has. You know, if there's plant consciousness, it's so different than ours. It's almost impossible to conceive of it. But we have trouble conceiving of animal consciousness, you know. So, but they are, you know, they're acting on us. The plants in my garden are acting on us. They repay my attention with their beauty or their fruits or their vegetables, and it's just feeling in relation. And what was so wonderful about that experience is that, you know, most of us don't feel part of nature. Or at best, we feel we have one foot in, one foot out. You know, we talk about having a relationship to nature. I mean, that makes no sense at all. We are nature. We are in nature. To say you have a relationship means you're a discrete being relating to another discrete being, but that's not actually what it is. But that's what it is in our minds. And that has to do with egotistical thinking. I mean, the fact that most of us believe we're really the only subject. You know, these other people, they probably have subjectivity also. But in fact, we can objectify them very easily, especially if they're different from us. And so we go through life, you know, with a very impoverished view of all the different subjectivities around us, and that we are one of many. And so in this experience, I felt very much part of nature, and more part of nature than I had ever felt. And you know, this kind of experience chimes with some research that's been done, you know, around nature connectedness. Robin Carhart Harris has done this at Imperial College, and there's of course the psychologists have a scale for every damn thing, but nature connectedness is like, how much do you feel you're in nature or outside of nature? And a single psychedelic experience on psilocybin raises nature connectedness scores. Now, that's a really small sample, and there's a lot of selection bias with people in psychedelic experiments. They're all willing to take psychedelics, and those people, I would imagine, are kind of more well-disposed to environmentalism in the natural world than not. So it remains to be seen if you give psilocybin to, you know, the Koch brothers in the United States, or some kind of like environmental criminal, whether you would get the same, or Trump, whether you get the same kind of change. It may well be that psychedelics intensifies inclinations you already have rather than changing them. So there's a lot of exciting work still to be done. But so I'm not sold that that's a universal quality of psychedelic experience. I am sold that ego dissolution seems to be, and that when the ego dissolves, various walls come down. And one of those walls is this wall that puts us at a distance to nature. But, you know, social walls come down, spiritual walls come down, and that in the experience of losing your ego, you're more likely to credit other subjectivities of all kinds.
Right. Yeah, I think I completely agree. And also I would argue that it's kind of, science shows us that that's a step in the direction of seeing reality more clearly. You know,